Okay, hi and welcome everyone to the Talking Animals, Law and Philosophy series. This is the first event in the Lent term and we're excited to have you all here in the meeting. I'm Raphael Fizel. I am the Executive Director of the Cambridge Centre for Animal Rights Law. I usually say a few words about how the Talking Animals series works for those of you who are here for the first time. We will start with a presentation by our speaker that will last about 30 to 45 minutes, and we'll then have the rest of the time for a discussion, for questions from you, for comments. If you'd like to come in, you're warmly invited to do so. Can I please ask you to use the raise hand function? You will find that under the reactions button of your Zoom app. If it's easier for you, you can also use the chat box. That works fine as well. I will mute all the microphones until we reach the discussion part. We are recording the event as usual, and in case you'd like to watch it again or recommend it to a friend, we will upload the video perhaps by tomorrow or so to our website and to YouTube, so you can find it there. Okay, I think that's all as far as housekeeping is concerned. And it is now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker. We are honored to have with us today Thomas White, who is Conrad N. Hilton Professor in Business Ethics, Emeritus at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. Professor White received his PhD in philosophy from Columbia University, and he taught at Uppsala College and Rider University in New Jersey before he moved to California. Since retiring from Loyola Marymount, he has lived in Amherst, Massachusetts. His primary research is on the ethical implications of scientific research on dolphins. Professor White's book on the topic is called In Defense of Dolphins, The New Moral Frontier, and was published by Blackwell in 2007. The book addresses ethical issues connected with the human-dolphin interaction, such as, for example, the deaths and injuries of dolphins in connection with the human fishing industry, as well as the captivity of dolphins in the entertainment industry. Professor White is a scientific advisor to the Wild Dolphin Project, a member of the advisory committee of the Kimmela Center for Animal Advocacy, and he was one of the authors of the Declaration of Rights for Cetaceans. His most recent writings can be found on indefenseofdolphins.com. That's all one word. Please join me now in welcoming Professor White for his presentation on flourishing and the 5 fundamental rights. Over to you.
Thanks very much. If my audio or video gets dicey, please let me know. First of all, I want to thank you all for the invitation. This is one of the great things about Zoom, is that I can be in Massachusetts and you all can be in the UK and various other parts of the world, and we can still do this. So thanks very much. Before I get into the talk itself, I want to say that I'm going to go fairly quickly. My understanding is that the audience can be very broad. It may be general public down to people who are specialists. And I know there's at least one marine mammals dolphin specialist online who knows much more about this than I do, Denise Herzing. I don't know if Laurie Marino has been able to come on board yet, but I want to make sure that there's, for people for whom this is relatively new, particularly as it relates to dolphins, that everyone at least has a baseline of information. And so I'm going to go through the talk fairly quickly. I'm happy to expand on anything, but that's at least how I wanted to set things up. So we had a little problem before with screen share, so we're going to hope that that's not a problem anymore. How are we doing on that, Raphael? Is that
It's working fine now. Yeah, we're in full screen now. You're good to go.
Okay, great. So as I said, were I to give this particular talk a slightly different title, it would be Dolphins, Captivity, Flourishing, and Rights. Sort of the challenge of interspecies ethics. This is, broadly speaking, part of this general discussion that we're all having about the moral rights of non-human animals. So this is sort of a subset of that. The way that my work has evolved from In Defense of Dolphins is that I now think that the concept of flourishing is really critical to all of this. And the fundamental question is, what are the conditions necessary for flourishing? I'll talk more about that, but this is where the kind of the background of this. In order to sort of focus our attention in all of this, what I want to do is to talk about the fundamental ethical issue as it relates to human-dolphin interaction, which is captivity, which is one of the most egregious issues. And so this is why the trajectory of the talk will go as it does. The way we're going to do this is I'm going to just give some basic facts about dolphins for people who are not familiar with that, and then get into two different arguments related to the ethical unacceptability of captivity. One as it relates to personhood, and the other which then departs from that into the area my work is now working in, which has to do with the concept of flourishing. So, as I said, I'm going to go fairly quickly on this just to make sure that we have plenty of time. Dolphins are a small-toothed whale. It goes everything from the small dolphins to orcas to then the larger whales, but orca is actually, a large dolphin. Dolphins are mammals. They're air-breathing. They are warm-blooded. They bear their young alive, have mammary glands and hair. You typically don't see a lot of hair on dolphins, but when they're young, you can see more of that, some hair follicles. The ancestor of whales and dolphins was a land quadruped. Looks kind of something like this. This is a species that has been on the planet much longer than we have. Humans, for example, let me see if I can remember which of these is which. Laser pointer. So humans have been, Homo sapiens, something in the order of 100,000 years, I guess. Hominids 3 to 4 million. Cetacea, really 50, 60 million years when they went back into the ocean. And the modern dolphin, for example, generally speaking, we're talking about a design of about 15 million years. That is a huge difference between, us and these folk. And it does speak to the issue of sort of a longer evolutionary history, efficiency, and all the things that go with that kind of thing. But definitely, one of the points I want to make is that, and I'll talk a little more about this later, to the extent that humans make ethical judgments about what counts as ethically appropriate treatment towards non-human animals, it's frequently how much are they just like us? That is, we focus on similarities. Part of my argument is that it's probably more important to focus on differences in order to get a really accurate picture and a good sensitivity to the ethical issues. So this is a good difference to keep in mind. Okay, one of the other differences between humans and dolphins is that they spend most of their time in a world that is dark. If you've spent any time in the ocean, you know that you go down 10, 20 feet, it starts getting dark fast, and especially when life in the ocean is so much busier when it's dark at night. Becomes one of the key adaptations, which is also important to keep in mind about the differences. What that means is that the way that dolphins have coped is through their echolocation, which gives them basically three-dimensional capacity. They send out sound waves, it bounces off targets, the sound comes in through the lower jaw, and they're able to get basically images in their brains about what's going on. And they're three-dimensional because sound goes through living tissue and bounce back in different ways. And one of the most remarkable capacities that dolphins have is this ability to use sound to fine-tune it in a way to perceive the objects around them. Now, this does raise an interesting question, because if, for example, you were to put an object in a box in front of most humans, we couldn't tell what's inside of it. It would be normal not to see inside. From the standpoint of a dolphin's perspective, it would be normal to be able to see inside the box. For example, they can see through one another. They can detect changes in, within the bodies of one another and within our bodies by use of sound. It does raise an interesting question. Surely, they're aware that we do not have this capacity. It raises an interesting question. What do they think of us? It would not be surprising, when you run across someone who does not have a sense that you have, it is not surprising for humans to think, oh, gee, that's a shame that that person is somehow deficient in some fashion, or at least lacking something. It would not be unusual to think that, not be unreasonable to think that dolphins think that in some important way we are lacking as a species, simply because we don't even, it's bad enough that we can't, that what we do in the water doesn't count as swimming from their perspective. Even something as, for them, simple common sense ability to perceive through objects, is, again, this is one of those differences that's important to keep in mind about how we then evaluate who they are, who we are, and what counts as appropriate interaction. Dolphins are highly social, probably more social than humans are in many ways. They have a variety of roles, long-term relationships, sexuality plays a really significant role, both in heterosexual, homosexual, all kinds of relationships. So there's wider function than in humans, probably. Dolphins, despite the stereotype of the happy jumping flipper, dolphins are, like any other being, aggressive as appropriate. The most interesting thing here, though, is that the aggression is restrained. It is rare to see, and Denise Hersing and others can speak about this more, but I'm aware that there rarely are stories of dolphins actually killing one another. They will beat one another up like crazy in sorting things out. Not seriously, but it's clearly very aggressive behavior. So it would be surprising if they weren't, but it's important to get good sense of the kind of full social life that and social roles that they have. One of the most interesting things is that they actually have shown curiosity about us. There are few instances of wild non-human animals showing any interest in us to the point where they would come out and want to hang out with us. Now, that's not universal. There are only a couple of communities or a few communities of dolphins in their natural habitat who are showing any interest in interacting with humans, but it's humans have that curiosity. That is, we've been looking for folk who are like us, and it seems that dolphins do the same thing. That is, they are frequently interested in us, and if you've spent any time with them in the water, it's not unusual to be in a situation where you get the feeling they're trying to figure out, for example, are you any good in the water? And that there's something going on there that satisfies some sense of looking for another being of the same sort that they are. Now, so that's sort of basics about who dolphins are, what kind of beings they are. I want to move on to the next piece of thing, which I said, ultimately, I'm going to make a couple of arguments about why captivity is ethically unacceptable, and one revolves around the issue of personhood. Now, particularly as it relates to animal law, personhood is a big deal because it's really the fastest way, and my understanding is, I'm talking to lawyers who do this is kind of the fastest way in to ensuring certain kinds of protections for non-human animals, particularly if you're talking about elephants, if you're talking about dolphins. If you can establish that you're talking about a person, the legal argument becomes much better. But of course, humans tend to use human and person interchangeably. So it's important to realize, first of all, human is a biological concept. To be a human simply means that you're a member of Homo sapiens. Person is a philosophical concept. That is, a being with special characteristics who therefore deserves appropriate treatment. There's been a long tradition in philosophy of arguing what are the criteria for personhood. One of the reasons this is important to take seriously is that from a legal standpoint, or in terms of what you could get through a legislature, my toaster could have the rights of a person. I mean, legally, it just means you're able to have a legislature guarantee certain protections. The heart of the argument is not really then what has happened in law, but can you take a philosophical concept and then get the kind of protections that deserves in a legal setting? So what then are the criteria for what it is to be a person? Now, as I said, philosophers argue about this, as indeed philosophers argue about everything. What I'm going to do is give you a set of what I consider to be pretty strict criteria. There are some criteria that are, you'll find a shorter list than this, but this is about as rigorous a list as I could come up with. My thinking was that, if you can find, whether it's dolphins, elephants, or other folk who meet those criteria, you may as well go with the hardest barrier to get over. Now, you'll see as we go down the list that there's a gradation. We go from easier to more difficult. Obviously, first of all, a person is going to be alive in some fashion. We're going to sidestep the whole issue of whether AI counts as alive, but you can understand why that would be an issue. Persons are aware. There's some capacity to be aware of the world around them. Their ability to experience pleasure and pain, positive and negative sensations. That is, they are able to take in information about the world and have that register internally. They have emotions, or at least display behavior that we reasonably would interpret as emotions. One of the reasons, emotions get a really bad press in philosophy, ignoring the fact that emotions are very largely a source of information about the world around us. And so when philosophers trash emotions, I always think, you're just missing about half the game of our capacity to get data and then to use that to make decisions about. So it's but of course, virtually every animal has emotions. So we're not in a threshold. We haven't hit a threshold yet that separates dolphins from other folk. As it gets more serious, self-consciousness and having a personality seems to be key. Self-consciousness is absolutely critical. We're talking about an inner world. We're talking about the ability not only to perceive the world, but to reflect on the contents of our consciousness. There are only, as far as I know, limited number of beings on the planet who can do this. Humans can, dolphins can, elephants can, other folk can, but this now becomes a really very important criterion. The ability to control one's behavior, that is not simply to perceive reality, to take in data, but to use that in order to make choices, to recognize and to treat other persons appropriately, to have a series of higher order cognitive abilities. And in that regard, we're talking about things like abstract thought, learning, solving complex problems, and communication that suggests thought. Now, this is a pretty strict set, pretty rigorous set of criteria. Everything from simply being alive, but as you see, we go down the list, it gets more sophisticated. It gets more rigorous as far as what kind of expectation we have of the kind of being that we're talking about. And for the most part, human beings demonstrate these things. Now, where does that take us as far as dolphins are concerned? Well, 30, 40 years of scientific research brings us a lot of really interesting and very important findings. Laura Marino has done great work on the structure and capacities of the dolphin brain. Ken Martin, Diana Reese, and Laurie Marino work on self-awareness. We've seen that. The ability to solve problems by planning, not simply just reacting to situations, but by planning ahead of time. John Gurian, Stan Kuzak. The ability to understand artificial human languages. Land-breaking work of Lou Herman for a number of years on this capacity. Tool use, Rachel Smoker. Dolphin social intelligence, Denise Herzing's decades-long work in the Bahamas, as well as Randy Wells and Richard Connor. Cetacean culture, Hal Whitehead and Rachel Smoker are very important on that. And then various people doing work on demonstrating advanced intellectual skills, solving interesting ways of getting food, understanding syntax, representations of reality, pointing and gazing behavior, which are complex cognitive processes. We've seen, as I said, decades worth of work that show we're talking about beings with really sophisticated cognitive capacities. The dolphin brain, Laurie Marino's nice way of putting this, they possess the neurobiological goods which underlie complex intelligence. By that, she means we're talking about a large brain, particularly relative to the size of the body, that it has an expanded neocortex, particularly in the areas of higher order processing, a sophisticated cytoarchitecture. Now, also this, I'm going to come back to this, but this right now, this is important in the sense that a favorite way that humans have to show that we're different is to point out, you know, where we stand in terms of encephalization quotient. That is the ratio of the weight of the brain to that of the body, which supposedly implies behavioral complexity and cognitive capacity. Now, as you'll see, humans are always at the top of the scale here, but dolphins do pretty well. And this isn't even the most impressive species of dolphin at that. Chimps down here, other mammals down below. So even by one of our own measures, dolphins do extremely well. Spindle cells, that is von Economo neurons, which are associated with self-awareness and social awareness, things like empathy, guilt, embarrassment, and love, have been discovered in whales. Now, this is really interesting. As I said, the idea of self-awareness is very important. This is one of the, you know, in the proverbial, a picture is worth 1,000 words. This is a situation where if we look and we see, this is a bit of a video of a dolphin looking at its reflection in a mirror, and you can decide what you think of that. Certainly suggests that you know, the dolphin is looking at itself, moving around, and there's been a variety of work done on this that shows that what we're talking about are beings who recognize that is itself, that is who it is. If you put your dog or cat in front of a mirror, you're unlikely to see this kind of behavior. But it's it's instructive, again, just in terms of the, you know, one picture is worth 1,000 words. Takes us to the question then, is a dolphin a person? I would say, well, if we say they're alive, they're aware, definitely ability to feel pleasure and pain. Lots of research about what seems like behavior driven by emotions, self-consciousness and personality, certainly self-awareness. If you're talking about planning in particular, you're talking about self-controlled behavior, recognizing, treating others appropriately, higher order cognitive abilities. We get a lot of that. It really seems as though that fits. And so the dolphins indeed are persons. That is, that they're who, not a what, that they are beings with an individual self-aware consciousness, and that they have moral standing as individuals. Now, this is very important because when you talk to conservationists, they tend to, if they worry about anything, they worry about groups, they worry about populations. The significance of personhood is that you're now talking about having moral standing as an individual, so individual rights in that regard. And the most significant from the standpoint of captivity, the most significant ethical implication is that a person cannot be regarded as property or as an object. Now, personhood has a lot to go for it because it is a useful way to get humans to recognize other beings as being worth a certain kind of treatment, because we get the, gee, they're just like us, and so they deserve good treatment. The problem is, though, as I said right at the outset, there's a problem if you just base everything on similarities, the similarities between us and other beings. Because what it does is you end up with personhood not being a species neutral concept, which is what everyone wanted it to be, but really because of the way the criteria get defined, it becomes a matter of it's too anthropocentric a you know, a concept. And one of the ways in which you can see the problem, if you just go so much with similarities, is we go back to the encephalization quotient. As I said, what we have is where humans are at 7, dolphins come up at 4.6. Now, my recollection of the literature was that it took a while before, and I think Laurie Marino was the first one who did this, who said, well, you know, dolphins are, in fact, as all whales, their bodies have much greater fat than humans do. What happens if we back that number out? Well, if we back fat out both with humans and dolphins, it becomes much closer. So again, the idea of, well, let's just use a human standard encephalization quotient, see what it comes up with. I mean, this was not bad faith. This was just the bias that we have about our own species is so ingrained that it took a while before scientists said, well, yeah, back out the fat ratio, back out the amount of fat, and what we get is then something, even by that measure, is much closer. The other question is, to what extent do we, rely on things like that rather than simply behavioral observation? But that then becomes one of the ways in which we now really want to look for something else. We want to proceed with a more species neutral standard, and that then stresses more the importance of differences. So what I would argue is that looking through the lens of species that regard as alien, as it were, allows us to be more aware of the critical differences. And this can then help us be better about having, say, species-specific or species-appropriate definitions of things like intelligence and self, which are not necessarily the same across the board, no matter what kind of species you're talking about. My preference for how we proceed, as I said at the outset, I've gone from emphasizing personhood to emphasizing flourishing, is that I think flourishing is the best we have for having a species neutral or species appropriate set of criteria for how we determine what counts as ethically acceptable and ethically unacceptable treatment of non-humans. Now, the best theorist I believe on this is Martha Nussbaum. Everyone should be familiar with her work. She has a brand new book, Justice for Animals, which will be considered, absolutely standard, in the field. So I think in fact it was published on January 3rd. I had an advanced copy. I did a blurb for it. It's a terrific book. But Martha Nussbaum's been using the concept of flourishing for years, and this will be the Bible of for how we worked with all of this. Now, what does flourishing mean? Nussbaum's definition: so each creature has a characteristic set of capabilities or capacities for functioning, distinctive of that species. And those more rudimentary capacities need support from the material and social environment if the animal is to flourish in its characteristic way. Now, a somewhat different way of putting this, which I'm a little more comfortable with, if we say, okay, what flourishing is the full, healthy, and emotional growth and development of the traits, skills, and dispositions that allow a being a reasonable opportunity to have a rudimentarily satisfying and successful life as a member of that species. So we aren't just talking about lifespan. We're talking about what are the conditions necessary for a member of a species of a particular sort to have the opportunity. This is even, it's simply to have the opportunity to have a reasonably satisfying life in terms of, a full life, a healthy life, the appropriate physical and emotional growth and development of the traits, skills, dispositions necessary to have that kind of life. So this is what I consider to be the most important concept to work with whenever we talk about ethically acceptable and unacceptable treatment of non-human animals. What are does this treatment promote flourishing? Does it get in the way of flourishing? Now, the ethical significance then is, I would argue, as I said, I talk a lot about the issue of captivity, failure to provide persons with the conditions necessary for flourishing can reasonably be labeled harm. And if the harm is serious enough, it can rise to the level of cruelty. And I've argued in some other pieces, that's the deal with dolphins in captivity. The conditions are so far away from what allow for flourishing. It isn't just harm, it's really serious harm, and it counts as cruelty. Now, this takes us to a slightly different way of talking about this. What I would argue is when we talk about rights, whether it's a fundamental rights or any of that sort that we talk about, rights are simply a shorthand for necessary conditions for flourishing. And in fact, I believe I'm now at the point of thinking of flourishing really as the foundational concept in ethics, whether we talk about it as it relates to humans, non-humans. The benefit of this is it's a concept that has objective basis. We can determine from a scientific standpoint, what are the conditions necessary for beings to flourish, no matter what the species. Now, what determines those conditions, that actually turns out to be really neat. It's just evolution, adaptation. The conditions that humans need for flourishing are the result of the evolution of our species over time. Same deal with whales, dolphins, and any other folk. The conditions necessary for flourishing are determined by what adaptations allowed those beings to thrive, to flourish, to get to the point of where they are. And so those conditions are basically hardwired as far as what it needs, what the necessary conditions are. What does it take for humans to flourish? This then, we can say, okay, we need species appropriate definitions of all of this. What does it take humans to flourish? Well, any discussion you'll see about human rights or basic human needs, that's what it's talking about. It's identifying the conditions that humans need to flourish. So in this regard, rights are not what any society simply decides to give to, members of that species. It's what are the needs that are already there that it's simply recognizing. So with humans, we need life, physical health and safety, emotional health and safety, absence of pain and suffering, freedom of choice, education, be treated in certain ways, access to meeting relationships, and and rest. If you look at any declaration of human rights, any list of human rights, this is basically what you get. You got some version of this combination of physical needs, emotional needs, things about how we're treated, and recognition of our social nature. But these are things that human beings require in order to have a sense of satisfaction in life and the ability that we at least have the opportunity to have a decent life. So what does it take for dolphins to flourish in their natural habitat, which of course is where they evolved? Okay, physical safety, secure sources of food, social interaction, familial and abilities to make choices, the opportunity to learn and perform survival skills, social roles and social skills, the opportunity to learn and pass on the group's culture, appropriate environment to developing physical abilities, such as echolocation and diving, freedom of movement, space, and appropriate challenges to learn and exercise control over their lives. We know the environment in which whales and dolphins developed, in which they evolved. We know what they need. We know what the conditions are. This is roughly in the same way that we can identify what the conditions are that human beings need in order to flourish. These are conditions that whales and dolphins need. Now, as Raphael mentioned, one of the ways in which this has been talked about on 2010, a number of us were called together and did issue a sort of declaration of rights for cetaceans. The details on this, you can see, reflect exactly what I've just been saying. So the right to life, number 2, no cetacean should be held in captivity or servitude or cruel treatment. 3, cetaceans have a right to freedom of movement, residence in a natural environment. Number 4, can't be property. 5, protection of their natural environment. 6, right to not have their cultures disrupted. So it's the same sort of thing as we've been talking about, that when you talk about a highly social being with significant cognitive capacities that's developed in that way in that natural environment with cultures that get passed on, these then become the necessary conditions for flourishing. And as I said, my understanding of rights are simply recognizing the necessary conditions that have to be met in order for a being to flourish. Okay, so what conditions make flourishing possible? Again, we just have to look and see what they live, the situation in they live. A dolphin's community's home range may be 100 to 400 square miles. Some dolphin communities number in the hundreds. An orcapod may travel 100 miles in a day. Orcas can dive to 100 to 200 meters when foraging. and they'll live their lives with in multiple generations. They're matrilineals. When you contrast what, is a large SeaWorld tank versus where, for example, communities of orca live in the Northwest, Canada and the US, massive difference. It's like it is impossible to imagine that a being who needs this kind of space and these conditions could flourish in something that small and artificial. If we just talk about life expectancy, as Laurie Marino writes, chronic stress leads to immunosuppression and susceptibility to physical disease in marine mammals that impacts mortality rates. Captivity for orcas is catastrophic. Most captive orcas do not survive past the age of 20 years. The natural average lifespan for male and female orcas is 29.2 and 50 years, respectively, with a maximum longevity of 60 and 90 years, respectively. And if there's loads of data about this. This is from WDC, the Whale and Dolphin Conservation. Median survival time in captivity, 4 years versus the wild, same thing. It just, there is no comparison. And again, look, even if this turned out to be the same, lifespan is not the only thing that counts as far as flourishing goes. One of the unfortunate things about the way that the entertainment industry has tried to, sort of control the narrative is to focus on issues of longevity. Quality of life is more important. We would not say that just because a human being is able to live sort of 100 years in an artificial, insular, barren setting, that would be a good life. There's no reason we can make the same argument about cetaceans. So, is flourishing possible in captivity? Well, the industry says yes. The truth is that our killer whales are healthy and happy and thrive in our care, says SeaWorld. Denise Herzing has argued captivity gives us only a shadow of a fully actuated dolphin in the wild. And I don't know of anyone who can make that statement with more authority than Denise, who has spent decades observing dolphins in their natural habitat in the wild. And so that really is just a striking statement and about as good as you can get in terms of an authority on the issue. Laurie has said the abundance of scientific evidence shows unequivocally that cetaceans cannot thrive in captivity. So where we are is that what I've argued is that even if you just start with looking at the basic research about dolphins, you get an idea: highly social, significant cognitive capacity, very important differences between us. Even according to our own standards regarding personhood as an anthropocentric concept, they do really well. If we get more intellectually sophisticated and use something less species biased with concept of flourishing, where we become aware of the significant things about their species that mean that things like captivity in entertainment facilities, deaths of individual dolphins in connection with fishing, just does not, just cannot pass muster ethically. And so what I'd argue is that particularly when we talk about dolphins, but now also as we move into looking at elephants and other non-human animals, the concept of flourishing is critical because it keeps us intellectually honest. It stops us from saying, how much are these beings just like us? The question becomes not just how are they just like us, but what counts as harm, and harm is determined by the conditions necessary for flourishing. So as I said, I was just going to sort of tear through things, which I have done. I didn't want to take too much time, so I'm happy to, here, I will stop this share and turn it back to our host.